Hi everyone! Today I'll be painting the Scarab Occult Sorcerer using a variety of paints, including contrast paints in a few different ways. Starting with the model being Zenith primed. It's simply primed black with white primer sprayed down over it. Start off with airbrushing Kantor Blue as the base for the armor. It's important to get the paint the proper consistency and chunk free for the airbrush. I just used water for thinning this layer. Give the model a solid coat of Kantor Blue. Next, I'll airbrush white Scar onto the armor. Testing the airbrush to make sure everything is running smoothly. The effect I'm going for with this armor is an insect-like carapace, so for that, I'll build up white in areas that the light would hit. For this type of surface, I make the highlights very circular. You don't want these highlights to drown out the base layer, so go for around half of the area as a highlight. Make sure to get a solid white layer to maximize the effect we're going for. I'll go back and hit areas with another layer of white to get it as bright as possible. Here's what it looks like after I'm done with this airbrush step. Now I'll use some Kroxigor Scales with the airbrush. Once again, I'm just adding water to thin the paint. Give it a test to make sure it's got the right consistency. Start with a thin layer and coat all the armor areas. Once an area is dry, I'll go back and see if it needs another layer, using it to darken the lower reflective areas like on the shoulder. Here's how it looks once it's dry. Next, I'll be adding more reflective points to the armor, this time with a green highlight to simulate an insect carapace. Going to start off with Sybarite Green and do some edge highlighting using a detail brush with a good tip. For big long edges like this, I like to use the side of the brush. It's much easier to keep it consistent this way instead of using the tip. Here's how it looks with the edge highlights done. Next, I'll be starting the reflections. I'll thin the Sybarite Green with some Lahmian Medium, about a 50-50 mix. Start with a main center line and work your way out with smaller lines as they get farther from the center, so it's sort of like a stretched circle. When placing these reflections, I like to put them in the dead spaces, generally in darker areas so there's some contrast, but on occasion I'll have it overlap with a lighter area. Make sure to mix up the sizes of the reflections so it's not too uniform. It's important not to load your brush up too much in this step, so the brush applies a thin, consistent layer. This is how it looks after the first step of the reflections is complete. Next, I'll do another layer with straight Sybarite Green. Starting about halfway into the reflection and repeat the same basic shape, looking for a solid coat of green on this step. Repeat this for all the reflections on the model. Next, mix some white Scar with Sybarite Green, about 60-40 green to white, then add a touch of Lahmian Medium. Test it out so it has the proper consistency and paint load on the brush. Highlight in the center of the reflections as well as some of the edge highlights. Next, mix white Scar and Sybarite Green together again, about 60-40 white to green. Highlight the very center of the reflections as well as the corners of the armor, as well as any small details like the studs. Here's how it looks with that step complete. Next, I'll smooth and fill out those reflections with a glaze of Sybarite Green thinned with Lahmian Medium. Using this step to fill out the reflections, if some are still looking a little spidery, and add some saturation to the lighter layers. Mix about 80-20 white scar to Sybarite Green and highlight the corners and very centers of the reflections. For the shoulder pads, I'll mix about 80-20 Sybarite Green to white scar with some Lahmian Medium and use the side of the brush to highlight the top. I'm starting with a lighter green so the highlight isn't darker than the base coat. Mix a bit more white scar into the paint and highlight again. With straight Sybarite Green and a little Lahmian Medium, I'm going to glaze the edge of the highlighted areas and add some paint to the lower parts as well. It's going to take a few layers to build up the green smoothly. Be sure to wait for the applied layers to dry before adding another layer. Took a few layers but finally got it done. With Kroxigor Scales contrast and some thinner medium, 2:1 medium to paint, apply a very thin layer to the edges of the reflections. This step will help remove any of the chalkiness of the thin, lighter layers, which they can have sometimes when applied over a dark foundation. Here's how it looks once that step is done and dry. Next up is the white cloth, starting with a base layer of Corax White. Don't try and get a solid layer of white in one layer. Keep the paint thin and apply a second coat of Corax White. Now, I'll wash the white with a mix of Carroburg Crimson and the thinner medium, which is quite viscous. Mix about 4:1 medium to wash. Apply it to the white cloth areas and make sure to move it around once it's applied if it's pooling too thickly or in the wrong areas. Once that's dried, do any touch-ups with a second layer. It's usually best to do something in 2 steps instead of 1. Problems can happen if you apply too much paint, and in the end it will take longer to fix those issues than doing it in 2 steps. Now that it's done and dry, I'll do the highlights. Mix a little Lahmian Medium with white scar and highlight the cloth. I'm using thinned paint so it takes a few layers. Don't try to apply too much paint, otherwise it will dry slower. You want thin and fast drying. It shouldn't take more than a few seconds to dry. This helps to apply more layers faster and creates a smooth appearance. If there's too much paint on the brush, I'll wipe it onto my glove to remove the extra. Here it is now that the white is done. Next up is the gold trim using Liberator Gold. Like all paints, but especially metallic paints, don't overpaint. I'll be applying a second coat to pretty much all of the gold areas. Once the gold trim is done, I'll give it a wash with Guilliman Flesh contrast. For this contrast paint, I like to end my brush strokes in areas where I want it darkest, since the last area where the brush contacts usually leaves the most paint. This will save time since I won't have to move the contrast paint around as much. It is very important for this step to not over-apply the contrast and make sure it doesn't pool in areas you don't want. While the contrast paint is drying, I'll base coat the steel areas with Leadbelcher. This is how it looks once it's all dry. Back to Corax White to base coat the scarabs and gems on the model. After that, I'll highlight the scarabs with white scar, mainly just to lighten the top parts of the scarabs for the next steps with contrast. With the white foundation complete, next I'll use Doomfire Magenta contrast and mix it with thinner medium, about a 50-50 mix. Apply to the scarabs and gems. Move the pigments around if they are pooling in undesirable areas. Applying a second coat to any areas that aren't pink enough, like the lower parts of the scarabs. After that is dried, I'll apply a thin coat of Beserker Bloodshade to the scarabs and gems. Make sure not to apply too much, just mainly around the edges and crevices on the pink areas. Next, mix Doomfire Magenta with white scar, 60-40 for white scar, and highlight the scarabs with a fine tip detail brush. Focusing on the top half of the scarabs and the edges. Now I'll use straight white scar just to add a few touches of white to the scarabs and gems. On the big scarab, I needed to lighten it more than the others. To help blend the layers, I'll use some thinned Doomfire Magenta, which will also add some saturation back. Here it is with the scarabs and gems done. For the armor seams, I'll thin some Drakenhof nightshade with thinner medium, about 2:1 medium to paint. Apply the mix to the seams and where the gold trim meets the blue armor. Be sure not to overpaint and apply any to the gold trim. Here's how it looks once it's all done and dry. Next, I'll base coat the sword handle with the Fang. Once that is dried, mix some black Templar contrast with thinner medium, about 2:1 medium to paint. I'm going to apply it to a few places, like the metal areas here on the back. After the metals are done, I'll also apply the mix to the sword handle. While that is drying, I'll work on the scrolls, starting with a base coat of Gorthar Brown. Next, I'll wash the scrolls with Reichland Flesh Shade. I'll apply a bit more shade to the bottom of the scrolls here. After that is dried, mix Flayed One Flesh with Gorthar Brown, about a 2:1 ratio, and add some Lahmian Medium too. Highlight the scrolls. Here, the brush is too loaded. I'll remove some of the excess paint onto my glove to get the right thickness of paint. For thin paint like this, it's important to know which direction the brush strokes go. Here, I'm starting towards the center and stopping at the ends of the scrolls. The last place the brush is has the most paint applied, and the first place has the least. Once it's dried, I'll go back and do another layer with straight Flayed One Flesh, focusing on the edges. Scrolls are now done. Next up is the yellow stripes on the headdress, starting with the base coat of Corax White. You'll notice that I will hold the model at multiple angles, especially here. This is so the side of the brush doesn't touch any of the other parts, especially the trim. After the foundation is finished, I'll use some Iyanden Yellow contrast and carefully apply it to the Corax White areas. This is what it looks like applied, and here it is when it's dried. Now I'll begin working on the burgundy areas, starting with the foundation of Barak-nar Burgandy. I'll use it to base coat the areas with this color. For the cloak, I'll be using a rather large brush, a size 9 synthetic. To start, I'm going to thin some Screamer Pink with Lahmian Medium, just a small drop to the mix. Once I get the right consistency, I'll start highlighting the cloak. I'll build up the color with multiple thin layers. This will be my third layer. And a fourth layer too. Once that's dry, I'll do the same with Pink Horror, also thinned with a little Lahmian Medium. Build up the pink with multiple layers, make sure to not over-highlight and drown out the Screamer Pink. Here it is with all the pink horror done and dry. Next, I'll go back to a Screamer Pink which I've thinned and glazed the edges of the pink horror areas. This will help blend the colors together and add some saturation back onto the cloak. For a bit more contrast, I'll use Black Templar thinned with thinner medium and apply it to the folds of the cloak. And that's it for the cloak. For the shoulder pads, it's a similar process to the cloak. Highlight with straight Screamer Pink and highlight the bottom edges as well. With a detail brush, highlight the edges with pink horror. Then, with an equal mix of pink horror and Screamer Pink, blend the highlights together. Now, use the Black Templar contrast thinned to apply over the area. To remove any overpainting, I'll just run my finger over the top. Back to the sword, base coat the blade of the sword with Corax White. Then edge highlight with White Scar. After that has dried, I'm going to use Fluorescent Pink from Green Stuff World, thinned with thinner medium, about 2:1 medium to paint. Apply the mix to the whole sword blade, make sure to move the pigment around so it pools the way you want it to, and remove any extra. When it dried, it did crackle a bit, so I'll just add a bit more to hide it and touch up any areas that need it. Once that is dried, I'll use some Blood Angel's Red contrast mixed equally with thinner medium to the bottom part of the blade. As you can see, as I paint up the blade, I'm removing paint from the brush onto my glove, so apply less to those areas. This is how it looks once it's dried. Now I'll blend the black hilt with the blade using Abaddon Black thinned with water. I'm using the same process as the Blood Angel's Red. As I paint up the blade, I'll remove paint on the brush onto my glove so I apply a thinner amount each stroke. Here's the end result. Next, I'll be highlighting the black parts of the sword with Fenrisian Grey thinned with Lahmian Medium, mainly focusing on the edge highlight. Now the sword is complete. Once everything is finished, I'm ready for basing. Here's the resin base I'll be gluing the model to. The base is by RainCityHobbies.com. I'll remove the model from the cork it's pinned into and cut away any cork the glue has stuck to. Test to see how deep the pin will be set into the base. This is a good length. Find a position on the base that looks good. Realign the pin so the model will fit flush with the base. Use the pin to score the resin base in the position you want, using my hand drill on the scored area. fit the model onto the base, check how centered it looks before gluing. Score the bottom of the feet to give extra grip for the glue to hold onto. Apply the glue to the feet and pin. I'm using thick gel superglue for this. Attach the model to the base and make sure it's in the right position. The model is nearly done, just a few more important steps. Here it is after I've matte varnished the model to protect it. However, this will leave the metals a little dull. So for the next steps, I'll be highlighting the metals starting with the gold using the Liberator gold mixed with Runefang Steel, about 2 to 1 in favor of the gold. Carefully highlight the edges. Once that gold highlight is done, I'll go back with Guilliman Flesh contrast and fix any problems with the first layer of contrast or overpainting with the metallic highlights. Mainly, I'm using it to darken areas that need it. Here's the gold all done. It's the same process for the rest of the gold trim. Next, I'll edge highlight the iron areas with Runefang Steel. For the tubes, I'll make sure there's very little paint on the brush and it's quite dry, and sort of dry brush the tube detail quickly with the side of my brush. And that's it for this model. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please like and subscribe. With your support, I'll be able to do more tutorial videos like these.